Hey guys, tonight we ride into the parched heart of the American West, not the one with handsome cowboys and shiny spurs, but the one that stinks a bit like horse sweat, broken dreams, and gunpowder. You find yourself squinting under a sun so harsh it feels personal. The wind kicks dust into your teeth as you trudge through a crooked main street lined with warped timber buildings. A rusty saloon sign swings overhead, and somewhere behind it, a piano hits a sour note and stops. Dead silence follows, except the crunch of your boots on gravel and the low whine of a buzzard circling above. This is no movie set. This is the real frontier, raw, unforgiving, and honestly, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you all listen in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Wild West wasn't wild the way they told you. It wasn't a theme park full of duels and dramatic tumbleweeds. It was a pressure cooker of human chaos, where rules bent under heat and bullets often made the law. As you move through this first town, there's something odd in the air, something beyond the grit in your nose and the sourness of stale beer. It's tension. The kind that settles in a place where justice has to be carried in a holster. Take a deep breath. Smells like unwashed bodies, cowhide, rotting fruit, and a hint of blood. That's because many of these frontier towns sprang up almost overnight. Mining camps turned into cities in weeks. There were no zoning laws, no sanitation, and certainly no sheriff who wasn't already halfway corrupt. Streets doubled as latrines. Disease traveled faster than gossip. You pass a faded sign nailed to the side of a general store. No Indians, no dogs, no exceptions. Harsh, absolutely, but painfully common. Here's a mainstream truth. Between 1800 and 1900, over 300 new settlements popped up across the West, most of them populated by desperate men chasing gold, land, or the illusion of freedom. But what you don't see in the movies is how many of those men were running from the Civil War, from debts, from the law. A lot of them didn't even know how to shoot straight. Historians still argue whether frontier gun culture was more myth than muscle, with most folks relying on knives or blunt objects when fights broke out. Guns were expensive, ammo even more so. You glance at a filthy alley beside the blacksmith's forge. There's a child digging through trash, barefoot, face smeared with soot. Might be 5, maybe 7. Frontier life didn't wait for you to grow up. By 10, you were a worker. By 15, you'd probably seen someone die. Life was fast, hot, and usually short. Fun fringe fact. Some towns paid their undertakers in beer. Seriously. There was so much death, and so little money, that barter systems got creative. One undertaker in Bodie, California, reportedly accepted payment in chickens, boots, and once, a donkey with 3 legs and 1 good eye. The donkey was the better deal. A rattling cough echoes from a boarding house window. Tuberculosis, maybe. It wiped out thousands out here, along with cholera, dysentery, typhoid. The Wild West wasn't just wild because of outlaws. It was wild because medicine, sanitation, and clean water were exotic luxuries. You were more likely to die from drinking the local well than in a shootout. And speaking of death, funerals were public, sometimes rowdy events. With no formal graveyards, folks were often buried behind saloons, in shallow plots marked with a boot or bottle. Some cemeteries were nothing more than fenced-in dust fields where coyotes regularly dug up the remains. One town, El Paso, had a stretch known as Dead Man's Alley, used not for poetic drama, but because bodies were literally dumped there during outbreaks. Yet even here, in this mess of mud and vice, you find traces of human stubbornness. Some folks tried to build churches. Some ran schools out of their kitchens. Others set up printing presses and churned out tiny newspapers filled with half-truths and biased rants, usually blaming foreigners, the government, or the next town over. Propaganda and paranoia flourished here like cactus in sand. One final detail before we move on. Frontier justice wasn't just flawed, it was performance. Trials were held in saloons. Judges were sometimes drunk. And juries? Usually the same guys you saw gambling at the poker table 2 nights ago. You could be hanged based on rumor alone, and some folks were. You reach the edge of town now. The sun is dipping low, throwing the world into a long bronze hush. Shadows stretch like fingers over the prairie. Somewhere out there, past the scrubland and the canyon and the hills, someone's plotting a heist. Someone else is burying a secret in shallow dirt. And you're just getting started. The road out of town is a loose thread unraveling into sagebrush and heat shimmer. You follow it, hooves crunching against pebbles, your horse's breath steaming slightly in the dusk air. It's quiet, but not empty. There's always something watching. A rattler under a rock, a scout in the hills, a memory buried somewhere just beneath the dirt. Now let's talk about the gunslingers, those dusty legends they taught you to admire. Men with names like Doc, Wild Bill, Billy the Kid, smooth hands, dead eyes, quick draws. But here's the trick. Most of them weren't what the dime novels claimed. You hear a whisper of a name carried on the wind. Maybe Jesse James, the guy who robbed trains and wore that tragic Southern charm like a badge of honor. Truth is, Jesse wasn't just a bandit, he was a Confederate guerrilla. He learned to kill in the bloody backwoods of Missouri during the Civil War, where ambushes meant hacking travelers to pieces in the dark and stringing up corpses as warnings. Historians still argue whether Jesse was a freedom fighter or a violent opportunist hiding behind political slogans. Either way, his legend got cleaned up real nice for the tourists. And he wasn't alone. Many of the most famous outlaws came straight from war-torn fields, Union or Confederate, shell-shocked, ruthless, broke. The war ended, but their appetite for action didn't. So they kept fighting, only now it was for gold, notoriety, or just because they didn't know how to stop. You pass a rock outcrop where someone's etched initials into the sandstone. Beneath it, God forget me not. A little dramatic, sure, but probably sincere. The frontier wasn't kind to lost souls. Here's a mainstream fact to sit with. The term gunslinger didn't exist in the Old West. Not once. It was invented later by Hollywood writers trying to romanticize what were, in reality, often just vagrants with decent aim. Back then, if you carried a pistol, you were more likely to be called a pistolier, a shootist, or, most commonly, a desperado. Fewer spurs, more desperation. And get this, most famous duels? Never happened. The whole high noon, 2 men face-off thing? Pure fiction. Real gunfights were usually ambushes. Bar brawls gone wrong. One man shot the other in the back. Or both missed entirely and hit a horse. One duel, between Wild Bill Hickok and Davis Tutt, was the rare exception. It was orderly, in a town square, with witnesses. But it was famous mostly because it was so rare. You find an old grave along the trail, half covered in thistle. The name's gone, worn off the wood, but a bullet's still lodged in the post. The West had a short memory. People lived fast, died faster, and were often forgotten in between. And now for your fringe tidbit, some gunfighters were actually just actors. Literally. In the late 1800s, traveling shows featured fake outlaws, washed-up cowboys, or even ex-cons paid to reenact shootouts on stage. One guy, Buckskin Joe, built his whole career playing a bloodthirsty bandit despite never firing a real shot in anger. He died of food poisoning, not lead poisoning. You continue down the path as night rises like ink across the sky. Coyotes bark somewhere far off. The stars blink in. Up ahead, you spot a campfire flickering, just one. Maybe a trap, maybe a lonely traveler. Here's the part nobody likes to admit. Outlaw life was a hustle. Most notorious criminals robbed a train or two, maybe held up a bank, and then spent the rest of their lives running from bounty hunters, sleeping under shrubs, and eating jerky that could shatter teeth. There was no gold pile waiting, no epic showdown. Most died cold, alone, and with nothing but bad breath and bullet holes to show for it. Take Billy the Kid. His legend says he killed 21 men, one for every year he lived. Actual historians believe the number is more like 4. Still not ideal, but slightly less cinematic. He died at 21, shot in the dark by Sheriff Pat Garrett, who was once his friend. And yes, that sheriff later sold a book about the whole thing. You gotta fund your legend somehow. And those sheriffs? Often just as dirty. Many switched sides like gamblers switch poker tables. If crime paid better than the law, well, the badge got lost for a while. There's record of town marshals robbing their own stagecoaches, then leading the investigation. Some towns didn't even have sheriffs, just the loudest guy with a big mustache and a rifle. You roll your shoulders, saddle creaking beneath you. Somewhere behind you, a tumbleweed skitters across the path. The silence grows thick again, but the image of those dusty legends, half myth, half madness, lingers like smoke. So next time someone drops the word gunslinger, just nod politely. And maybe ask them if they've heard about the one who died choking on his own mustache wax. That one's probably true. By morning, the sky is already burning. You crest a dry ridge and gaze down into a valley that looks like it's been punched flat by greed. Canvas tents stretch out like a sea of dirty laundry. Flags flap, hammers ring, and the stench, equal parts sweat, tobacco, and boiling coffee, hits you before the wind even shifts. Welcome to gold country. Everyone dreams of gold. But the truth is, most who came west with dreams of striking it rich found something far different: violence, disease, and scams slicker than a snake-oiled preacher. You ride into the fray as prospectors shovel dirt with glazed eyes, their skin burnt raw by sun and desperation. They look like they haven't slept in days, and many haven't. You're watching lives get ground down by mud and rumor. Here's a mainstream fact to carry in your saddlebag. During the California gold rush of 1848 to 1855, over 300,000 people flooded the state. They came from New York, Missouri, Chile, China, even Australia. But by 1851, nearly all surface gold was gone. From then on, it was industrial mining or nothing, and nothing won more often than not. Yet the myth persisted. Dime novels promised fortune. Word of mouth twisted failures into fables, and the towns? Oh, they grew fast and mean. You ride past one now, a mishmash of tents, lean-tos, and half-finished buildings. A sign reads, "Dry Gulp." Underneath, "Pop, 1,387. Who's counting? Fair enough. You stop at a saloon. Inside, a man's playing poker with one eye open and a revolver balanced next to his whiskey. Another fellow's passed out with his head on a dog. Nobody moves to wake him. The piano's missing most of its keys, but the barkeep pours you something brown and bitter like regret. The real gold, of course, wasn't in the dirt, it was in services. The smart folks opened shops, sold pans and dynamite, rented out beds for $1 a night, or sold water for 3 times what milk cost. That's your fringe fact for tonight. In parts of gold country, water was more expensive than whiskey. One guy in Nevada made a fortune selling eggs at $1 apiece. No chickens nearby, of course. He just had fast donkeys. But the blood? That was free. Vigilante justice ran rampant. You walk past a freshly built gallows. It's not even stained yet. They hang thieves, gamblers, or just unlucky men whose faces rubbed someone the wrong way. In 1851, a committee of vigilance formed in San Francisco, not a local book club, but a private militia of angry merchants who kidnapped, tried, and hanged people they suspected were criminals. Historians still argue whether they brought order or just chaos wrapped in self-righteousness. You wander to the edge of the mining camp where the noise thins out. Here, Chinese and Mexican laborers dig in silence, segregated by unofficial but brutally enforced custom. Their claims were smaller, their tools older, and their protection non-existent. Racist mobs often stole their gold outright or burned their camps to ash, and if they complained, the sheriff couldn't hear them over the laughter in the saloon. One Chinese miner, Li Qing, reportedly struck a modest vein in 1854 and was found dead 2 days later, throat slashed, gold missing. No arrest, no questions. The newspaper called it an unfortunate misunderstanding. You pass a row of tents labeled mermaid baths. Sounds fancy. It's not. It's one copper tub, half filled with grey water that 5 other guys have used before you. For a silver coin, the madam will let you soak, clothes optional, dignity not included. Suddenly, there's shouting behind you. A fight's broken out at the assay office, the place that verifies gold claims. A wiry kid screams that the scales were rigged. The clerk denies it. A punch flies. Then another. And then a gunshot. Just one. And then quiet again, like nothing happened. That's the thing out here. Life ends fast, but rarely with flair. Most people in gold towns died from accidents, cave-ins, explosions, or just plain starvation. Mining wasn't romantic. It was backbreaking, lung-choking, and wildly inefficient. One wrong blast and a shaft collapsed. One missed rope, and you fell 40 feet into darkness. But despite it all, the dream held on. Because once in a while, someone did get lucky. And the lucky ones got famous. Or they bought their way out, or they died fast enough not to suffer. The rest, they stayed. Digging, hoping, fading. As the sun sets over the camp, you notice a man burning something in a barrel. Old boots, maybe, or maybe a dead partner. Hard to say. You tighten your coat against the cold as dusk settles like a blanket soaked in smoke. You're starting to realize something now. The West wasn't built on gold. It was built on rumors and blood. You ride alongside the tracks now. They gleam in the sunrise like twin knives slicing across the landscape, carving it into neat, manageable pieces, at least from the railroad company's point of view. The land around you vibrates with the distant thunder of metal wheels, and you feel it deep in your bones, like a warning. Something massive is coming. Not just a train, but change. Irreversible change. The railroad was progress, sure. It connected oceans. It moved cattle, crops, and crates of dreams. But it also shattered what stood in its way: mountains, buffalo herds, native nations, and the backs of the people who laid the tracks. A mainstream truth for your travel journal. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, linking East and West for the first time. It took 6 years, thousands of laborers, and more than a few corpses to finish. It was hailed as a miracle of American grit. What they don't mention is that it was also one of the greatest human meat grinders in U.S. history. You pass a wooden sign half buried in weeds. No loitering, railroad property. It's faded and ignored. A few yards off, there's a grave with no marker, just a splintered pickaxe stuck in the dirt. Probably one of the many nameless men who died blasting tunnels or clearing snowdrifts. A little too slow, a little too tired. That was all it took. You squint at the tracks themselves, rails laid with iron, but forged with sweat. Most of the Western Line was built by Chinese immigrants. Nearly 15,000 of them. Paid less than white workers. Given the worst food, the most dangerous jobs, and zero recognition. They hung from ropes to blast dynamite into sheer cliffs. They froze to death in the Sierras. They were buried in avalanches, forgotten in landslides. And when it was over, not a single one was invited to the Golden Spike ceremony at Promontory Summit. Historians still argue whether the railroad united the country or simply bound it tighter for profit. What's clear is that every inch of progress had a cost, usually paid by someone who'd never ride the train. And speaking of the train, You hear it now, distant but growing, a low metallic moan, echoing off canyon walls. You step off the trail just in time. It blasts past with a shriek, kicking dust and debris into the air. A child on board presses her face to the glass and waves at you. You don't wave back. The contrast is too much. That train isn't stopping. Not for you. Not for the land. Not for anyone. You ride past what was once a buffalo trail. There are bones scattered here, sun-bleached, cracked. Thousands of bison used to move through this valley like a living river. Now, you could count the remains on one hand. And here's your fringe tidbit. Railroad companies offered discounts to hunters who supplied bison meat to workers. Some men were paid by the carcass. One legendary shooter, Buffalo Bill Cody, reportedly killed over 4,000 bison in less than 2 years. The bison weren't just animals, they were life. For the Plains tribes, they meant food, clothing, shelter, tools. Exterminate the bison, and you starve the people. It wasn't just sport. It was strategy. You ride toward a trestle bridge now, rickety, long and stretching across a dry gulch. You cross carefully, every plank groaning beneath your weight. Below, you see rusted spikes and the skeleton of a burned supply cart. Maybe sabotage. Maybe just a bad break. The West didn't do second chances. And the workers? If they died on the job, which many did, they were often buried in shallow, unmarked graves right beside the line they helped build. There's no plaque, no memorial, just the occasional boot poking up through the dirt. You wonder how many trains roll over someone's final resting place every day without even knowing. At the end of the bridge, you come across a camp. What's left of one, anyway? Ash piles, broken bowls, scraps of red silk. A Chinese work crew's leftovers, likely abandoned in a rush. Maybe a storm. Maybe worse. There's a silence here, deep and watchful, like the land remembers even if history does not. A page from an old newspaper flaps in the wind. You catch it. The headline reads, "Railway brings civilization west." Below it, an ad for patent medicine and a wanted poster. It meant someone got rich. It meant borders were redrawn. It meant telegraph wires slashing through ancestral land. Civilization was less about culture and more about contracts. You lean down and pick up a chunk of coal near the tracks. Still warm. Trains don't wait, but they don't forget either. They leave scars in the earth, black trails, faint whistles in the night. And you ride parallel now, following that iron serpent through hills that used to echo with drums, not steam whistles. You ride past towns that owe their birth to the train, and their slow death to it, too. Once the line changed, they dried up like spilled whiskey in the desert. Final note for the road. In 1870, native tribes began sabotaging rail lines, not out of malice, but out of grief. They knew what was being lost. One Lakota elder, when asked why they tore up the tracks, reportedly said, "It carries away the land. So as you press forward tonight, remember this: every mile the train conquered, someone else surrendered. The sound of the tracks fades behind you, replaced by the tinkling clatter of a wagon just over the rise. You crest the hill, and there it is, brightly painted, absurdly ornate, and parked in the middle of nowhere like it dropped straight out of a fever dream. Dr. Fenwick's miracle elixirs and electromagnetic restoratives. The canvas is cracked from sun, the lettering uneven. A bored mule swishes its tail, while a man in a plaid waistcoat stands on a crate yelling about tonics that restore masculine vigor and cure melancholy in 3 swallows or less. 2 kids clap. An old woman eyes a bottle labeled "Guaranteed to Reverse Tuberculosis." Welcome to the traveling medicine show. Here's a mainstream truth. In the absence of real doctors, and with the nearest hospital usually 3 weeks away by wagon, people turn to entertainers with jars. Medicine shows blended vaudeville, snake oil, and desperate hope. They promised miracles in a bottle, and often delivered, well, mostly alcohol, or morphine, or turpentine, or something worse. You dismount and blend into the small crowd. A man with a waxed mustache plays a fiddle while his partner spins wild tales. I once saw a man regrow a tooth with our patented elixir. Swear on my mother's grave. The audience chuckles, but their eyes stay glued to the bottles. A fringe detail for your mental scrapbook. One popular remedy, soothing syrup, was marketed for babies and teething. Its main ingredients? Alcohol and morphine. It did soothe by knocking kids out cold. A handful never woke up. The real genius of these shows wasn't the elixir, it was the performance. Barkers used magic tricks, trained animals, even dancing bears to warm up the crowd. Some featured preachers selling salvation by the jug. Others had beautiful women in feathered hats giving testimonies. One troupe toured with a one-legged Civil War vet who claimed he regrew the other leg. Spoiler, he didn't. Historians still argue whether these shows were harmless entertainment, criminal deception, or an early form of placebo therapy. But no matter the truth, folks lined up. Because the frontier was hard, the doctors were rare, and belief was sometimes the only medicine available. You walk past the wagon's back panel and spot a crate marked arsenic and stramonium for external use only. It's open, half empty, used in tonics for everything from headaches to asthma. One swig too many, and you'd be hallucinating raccoons that could talk. Or worse, someone bumps into you, a young woman carrying a wooden tray of small jars. She whispers, "Don't buy from him. It's just bourbon and pond water." Then she flashes a tired grin and keeps walking. Maybe she used to believe, too. Behind the show is a makeshift clinic, a tent with a rusting cot, a few bloody bandages, and a sign, "Private consultations, $2. You peek in. A man lies unconscious, wheezing faintly. His lips are stained black. Likely tried the iron tonic. You've seen that before. Too much metallic extract can turn your mouth that way. Not deadly, but not exactly curative either. Here's the thing about snake oil. The original stuff actually worked. It was made by Chinese immigrants using oil from the Chinese water snake, rich in omega-3s, and used for joint pain. But once the name caught on, imitators in the US slapped the label on anything oily enough to look legit. Over time, snake oil became slang for fake cures, and stayed that way. As the crowd disperses, the wagon starts to creak forward. Dr. Fenwick tips his hat to you, smiling like a man who's either very sincere or very practiced. "Remember, good health comes in small bottles," he calls out. The mule sighs, as if it's heard that line 1,000 times. You ride on, but the image lingers. That colorful wagon in a dusty field. The way people leaned in, not because they were foolish, but because they were hopeful. Out here, when nothing else worked, you reached for the bottle with the prettiest label and crossed your fingers. And sometimes, just sometimes, it worked. Or at least, it felt like it did. And out in the Wild West, that was usually close enough. The road curves, and your horse's hooves clop into softer earth. A gust of wind carries the sound of a piano, ragged, hurried notes drifting from somewhere nearby. As you crest the next hill, the town opens up like a worn playing card. Crooked saloon, sagging brothel, a crooked church missing its steeple. You've found another stop on the map of forgotten sins. But don't be fooled by the peeling paint and dusty windows. This place was once alive, loudly alive. You dismount near the saloon just in time to hear someone crash through the swinging doors with a yelp. A teenager, maybe 16, shirt unbuttoned, lip bleeding. He stumbles off without looking back. Inside, men cheer and raise their glasses. Let's talk vice. Here's the mainstream truth. Saloons were more than just watering holes. They were the heart, liver, and sometimes bowels of Western towns. They doubled as post offices, courthouses, poker dens, hotels, and boxing arenas. The first thing built after a general store wasn't a school, it was a bar. You step inside. The smell hits like a punch. Stale beer, sour sweat, and whatever's fermenting behind the counter. The piano keeps going, played by a woman in a yellow corset who's only half paying attention. Around the room, men in dirt-crusted coats sip rot-gut whiskey, trade lies, and cast glances at the upstairs hallway, where the real business happens. And that brings us to brothels, or hurdy-gurdy houses, or parlor rooms. Whatever the name, these weren't hidden in alleyways. They were front and center. Their madams sponsored parades. They donated to town improvements. One famous madam in Helena, Montana, paid for the town's first fire truck. In return, she demanded the driver tip his hat to her ladies every time he passed. But here's the darker edge. Many of those women weren't ladies of the night by choice. Some were tricked into coming west with false promises of marriage or jobs, only to be sold into sex work by the time they stepped off the stagecoach. And a lot of them, teenagers, some even younger. Records show girls as young as 12 working in mining towns, often addicted to laudanum just to get through the night. Your fringe tidbit for the night? One famous bordello in Dodge City kept a full-time violinist to play softly during sessions. Why? Supposedly to soothe the soul. That violinist later became a schoolteacher. Small towns, big pasts. You take a seat at the bar. The barkeep nods and slides over something amber. "How special," he says. "It tastes like varnish and regret." Beside you, a man mutters about losing his horse in a poker game. Another tries to sell you a map to buried gold he clearly drew in pencil this morning. Everyone here's hustling. And sometimes the hustle is the point. Saloons weren't just dens of sin. They were stages, theaters of performance, reputation, survival. A good storyteller could drink for free. A bad one might get stabbed. And if you cheated at cards, well, let's just say a lot of Western dental work involved missing teeth. And above it all, like a faded crown jewel, stood the madam. She wasn't always rich, but she was in control. Many ran their houses like tight ships, feeding their girls, protecting them from violent clients, even schooling them in bookkeeping or reading. Some became the wealthiest people in town. Others were burned out when the town got respectable and decided sin had worn out its welcome. Historians still argue whether these women were empowered entrepreneurs or victims of a brutal system with few exits. The truth, as always, likely falls somewhere uncomfortably in the middle. As you step outside, a woman stands on the porch of the brothel. She lights a cigarette and exhales like she's spent her life learning how. She nods at you, but doesn't smile. Behind her, a girl no older than 15 peeks through the curtain, just watching. And here's the thing, the West sold freedom. But for a lot of folks, that freedom only came in somebody else's pocket. You were free to drink, free to gamble, free to sell your body if someone else got the cut, but actual liberty. That was scarcer than clean socks. You mount up again as night spreads its long fingers across the town. The piano's still playing, off-key but steady. Someone upstairs laughs. Someone else cries. Both sounds get lost in the wind. This was the other side of the West, loud, tired, half-dressed, and utterly human. No spurs, no standoffs, just people trying to survive with the tools they were given. And most of those tools were already broken. By the time dawn breaks, the trail's thinner, the trees taller, and the air just cool enough to breathe without tasting dust. You're far from the saloons now. But the echo of what they represented still clings to your boots. Ahead, a wooden sign leans at a tired angle. Temperance Hollow, established 1874. And under it, in smaller hand-painted letters, no dancing, no liquor, no foolishness. Sounds fun, right? But tonight, you're not here for a church picnic. You're here to meet the women who didn't just live in the West, they reshaped it. Forget corsets and fainting couches. The frontier had no room for passivity. If you were a woman out here, you either fought for your space or got swept under the wagon. And some didn't just fight, they won. Here's your mainstream truth. While the East clung to its prim Victorian ideals, the West gave women something radical: opportunity. Wyoming became the first U.S. territory to grant women the right to vote in 1869. That wasn't because they were progressive. It was because they needed settlers, and women brought stability, families, and sometimes political leverage. But voting rights were just the tip of the iceberg. You pass by a whitewashed chapel-turned-schoolhouse where an older woman in boots is teaching 3 kids their letters while also holding a baby. That's frontier multitasking. One hand on the Bible, the other cleaning a rifle. You tie your horse beside the general store and wander down a dirt lane lined with posters. One catches your eye, a stern-faced woman holding a hatchet. The caption reads, "Carrie Nation strikes again." Now there's a name. She was a real woman. Carried a Bible in one hand and an actual hatchet in the other. She stormed into bars, smashed bottles, and berated drinkers in person. She didn't just preach temperance. She performed it violently. She was arrested over 30 times. Never once apologized. And she wasn't alone. That's your fringe tidbit. The temperance movement, often seen as a kind of moral wet blanket, was one of the few platforms where women could speak publicly and be heard. For many, it was their first taste of power. And once they had it, they didn't let go. But not all frontier women were reformers. Some were outlaws. Take Belle Starr, for instance. She rode with Jesse James, dressed in velvet and lace, while shooting from horseback. She carried twin pistols and allegedly ran her own horse-rustling operation. Historians still argue whether Belle was a full-blown gang leader or just a stylish sidekick, but either way, she made her mark. And then there were the women you don't hear about. The ones who ran freight wagons alone across Apache country. The black laundresses who followed army posts, not because they were safe, but because they were the only jobs open to them. The native women who spoke multiple languages and negotiated trade routes before treaties ever existed. You pass a weathered fence post with a carved inscription. To Sarah, she shot the snake, fixed the axle, and still made supper. That's a love letter, frontier style. Inside the town's one-room meeting hall, you find handbills announcing next week's debate. Should women serve on juries? The locals are taking sides with passion. One man claims, "Ladies are too delicate." A schoolmistress next to him replies, "Then maybe you should try birthing twins in a wagon." Oof. Point taken. Women weren't just pushing brooms, they were publishing newspapers, filing land claims, running cattle operations, and sometimes, yes, smashing bar mirrors with holy fury. It was messy, often lonely, and always dangerous. But here's something no textbook said out loud. The Wild West made room for women because it had to. There were too many jobs and not enough hands. Nobody cared if you were wearing a bonnet, if you could shoot straight, swing an axe, or negotiate with a drunk fur trapper. You had value. As you leave Temperance Hollow, a group of women pass you, headed to the town well. They carry buckets, rifles, and zero patience for nonsense. One nods at you. "Watch out for rattlers," she says. And men with smooth smiles. Noted. The trail bends back into open scrub. The town disappears behind you, but the impression lingers of a place shaped not just by rugged cowboys or gold-crazed prospectors, but by women who refuse to sit still. Women with grit in their teeth and steel in their spines. Out here, survival didn't care about gender. It cared about endurance. And these women? They endured. By late afternoon, the sun lowers like a heavy eyelid, casting long shadows across the canyon ridges. You ride through open land now, vast, rolling, ancient, but not empty. This place remembers. You pass petroglyphs etched into red rock, spirals, animals, figures with outstretched arms. Messages from before the border fences, before the rifles, before the railroads. You stop your horse and trace a spiral with your finger. It winds inward. The meaning is debated, But it doesn't really matter. You're standing on stolen land. Here's your mainstream truth. By 8. But what they didn't teach you in school is how deliberate the erasure was, not just of land, but of memory. You ride toward what used to be a Lakota encampment. The trees are thinner here. A few charred timbers remain from where tippies once stood. A rusted cooking pot lies half buried in the dirt. It's quiet, yes, but it wasn't always. Historians still argue whether the West was won by superior technology or by a calculated dismantling of indigenous resistance. The answer probably depends on who's writing the textbook. But the truth is, many tribes adapted. They made deals, learned English, rode horses better than any cavalry, fought smart, built alliances. Still, it often wasn't enough. And yet, the savage Indian myth endured, thanks to newspapers, stage plays, and those dime novels that always needed a bad guy. Entire generations grew up believing that tribes were either bloodthirsty or already gone. Both were lies. Take the Comanche. Horse warriors, yes, but also traders, diplomats, fiercely protective parents. One Comanche chief, Quanah, spent his early life resisting American expansion and his later years leading his people through it. He wore a war bonnet with one hand and a tailored coat with the other, lobbied Congress, hosted Teddy Roosevelt. Historians still debate whether he sold out or simply survived the only way left. Your fringe detail. Some native tribes used written language centuries before European contact. The Cherokee developed a syllabary system that allowed them to print newspapers, write laws, even compose love letters. Literacy was not a foreign concept, it was just a different form. You spot a hawk overhead, circling lazily. Below it, a herd of cattle tramples a line of what once were sacred stones. No markers, no fences, just forgotten burial grounds now grazed by longhorns. The land itself was once a library, full of stories, trails, gathering places. But it was paved, fenced, renamed. Think about that. When the West was opened, it wasn't empty, it was cleared. And that difference matters. Further ahead, you ride through a dusty mission ruin. A stone church, crumbling walls, a statue of a missionary whose face has been chiseled off. The church used to ring a bell 3 times a day, once for prayer, once for work, once for punishment. Not necessarily in that order. Christian missions were presented as beacons of salvation. But for many native children, they were the start of cultural erasure. Names changed, hair cut, language forbidden. You weren't just taught the Bible, you were taught to forget yourself. You hear a sound, drums, distant, faint, maybe real, maybe not. Some say the earth still holds that rhythm, buried just under the topsoil. In one direction, you see oil derricks, new metal skeletons rising from old scars. In another, a single tipi, hand-stitched, alone in the valley. A symbol, not a relic. Here's what they didn't teach you. Resistance never stopped. Native lawyers, artists and organizers continued to fight through the 20th century and into now. The Wild West isn't just in the past, it echoes in present-day land battles, water rights, and the quiet, powerful act of remembering. You ride out of the canyon, and the sunset hits just right, like fire across the ridges. For a moment, the land feels whole again. You imagine the stories it could tell if people would only listen. Not the stories with cowboys and campfires, but the ones that begin with, "We were here," and still are. The trail gets quieter as the night sets in, just cool enough for your breath to cloud in the moonlight. But up ahead, something glints under the starlight, like metal, but darker. You urge your horse forward and come upon it. A row of wooden stakes hammered into the dirt, each one with a rusted nail at the top. You know what this is before you even see the sign, Bounty Post. In today's world, bounty hunters bring up images of leather jackets and handcuffs. But in the Wild West, it was much uglier. This was an economy built on bodies, and sometimes pieces of them. Here's a mainstream fact to start with. Yes, bounty hunters were real. Men, and sometimes women, paid by the government or private citizens to capture fugitives, return runaway workers, or handle threats to local property. But the lines blurred fast. A bounty meant money. And once money entered the equation, humanity got real negotiable. You study the Post. One placard still flaps gently in the breeze. $200, dead or alive. The face is sketched in charcoal, and the word dead has been underlined 3 times. Not subtle. That was the thing. These weren't always criminals. Sometimes they were just inconvenient. Some were rustlers. Some were activists. Some were simply in the wrong place when the wrong rancher's cattle went missing. And here's the part they don't put in history books. Some bounties were paid not for a person, but for a body part. That's your fringe tidbit. Throughout much of the 1800s, several U.S. states and territories openly paid for Native American scalps. Governments issued scalp bounties to reduce hostilities. All you needed was proof. That could be a scalp, a pair of ears, or even a child's hand. Some towns had official scalp hunters with weekly quotas. One man in California made his entire living turning in body parts, documented. Paid. Historians still argue whether this practice was government policy or local abuse, but the paper trail is there. Official. Cold. Inked in bureaucratic language and read with reality. You continue down the road and pass a ragged tent with a low campfire. A man squats by it, polishing a revolver. He doesn't look up as you pass, but you notice the bracer on his forearm. U.S. Deputy, Temporary Commission. That's another piece of the story. Many bounty hunters were lawmen by day, mercenaries by night. Badges were given out like candy, revoked just as fast. You didn't need a uniform, just a willingness to bring someone in, and the stomach to shoot if needed, or even if it wasn't. One famous lawman, Tom Horn, worked for cattle barons in Wyoming. He was paid to deal with rustlers, which sometimes meant shoot on sight. He confessed to killing 17 men, though the number was likely higher. His final job was tracking a teenage boy suspected of stealing livestock. The boy ended up dead. Horn was hanged, or, as some believe, scapegoated. You stop by a creek to let your horse drink. The reflection in the water shows a pale moon, fractured by ripples. Behind you, a tree looms with a broken rope hanging from a limb. No plaque, no explanation. Just the silent suggestion that someone didn't make it to court. And sometimes, bounty hunting wasn't about bringing people in at all. It was retribution, sold as justice. In New Mexico, the Santa Fe Ring, a political and economic elite group, used hired killers to remove landowners who resisted. The law looked the other way. Or worse, wrote it off. There's a phrase you hear whispered out here. Wanted by someone, not by the law. That's all it took. You push forward, and in the distance, you spot a man tied upright to a post, arms out, slumped. At first, it looks like a crucifixion. Then you realize it's a dummy, a warning. Someone's way of saying, this could be you. At a nearby crossroads, another sign. Reward doubled for heads. You shake your head. It's not metaphorical. Out here, the currency of survival wasn't gold or cattle. It was fear. Fear kept towns quiet, made folks ignore what they heard outside their window at night. Fear made bounty hunting profitable, and fear turned killers into legends. You ride into the dark, stars above you, and the wind tugging at your coat. Behind you, the bounty post sways a little, creaking. Ahead lies only more dust, more tracks to follow. And maybe someone's following you. You wouldn't be the first, or the last. The wind changes. It's subtle at first, a slight shift in temperature, the scent of ash and something old. Your horse hesitates, snorts and paws the ground. You urge it forward, but even you feel it now, a pressure, like walking into a memory someone buried too shallow. You ride into what used to be a town. No sign says the name, but a few burnt foundations, a collapsed well, and a church skeleton tell you people once lived here. Laughed, fought, died. You've arrived in a ghost town. Here's your mainstream truth. By the end of the 19th century, over 1,000 towns were abandoned across the American West. Some ran out of gold, others dried up with the railroads. Few were wiped out by disease. But they didn't just vanish. They hollowed out, leaving behind shells, shadows, and stories too inconvenient for tourist brochures. The door to what was once a saloon creaks open as you pass. Inside, chairs lie on their sides. A playing card peeks from under a table. A moldy boot sits alone in a corner. The air is thick, not with smell, but with memory. You can almost hear the piano if you stand still enough. A drunk yell, glass shattering, a laugh cut short. Historians still argue whether some of these towns collapsed due to economic factors or whether something else crept in. Fires with no source. Families vanishing overnight. You can call it superstition. But walk around long enough and you'll feel it too. The quiet here isn't peaceful. It's loaded. And here's your fringe tidbit. Some of these abandoned towns were repopulated, not by settlers, but by squatters, drifters, and people hiding from the law. One town in Arizona was empty for decades until rangers discovered 5 families living in the cellars of ruined buildings. No names, no paperwork. Just stories they wouldn't share. You spot a house that's mostly intact and decide to explore. The floor groans under your weight. There's a child's toy, hand-carved and missing a wheel, sitting beside a crumbling cradle. No dust on it, which is odd. Someone's been here. You back out slowly. Outside, the wind picks up. A door bangs somewhere behind you. You turn, but there's no one there. You tell yourself it's just the breeze. The West is full of breezes that sound like voices. Further down the street, a jailhouse stands with one rusted cell, still locked tight. Through the bars you see scratches on the wall, counting marks, like someone kept track of days, or nights, or screams. The final tally stops abruptly. You wonder what happened that day. The roof's caved in at the church, but the bell is still there, hung low like a head bowed in grief. You give it a nudge. It doesn't ring. It clunks, like a throat choked with silence. And this wasn't rare. Ghost towns weren't exotic relics. They were normal. People vanished here because life was impossible. Water ran out. The mine collapsed. The sheriff got shot, and no one came to replace him. And with no law, no supply, no safety, people left. But sometimes not all of them. You come across a cemetery, half swallowed by weeds. Dozens of wooden crosses, some tilted, some snapped. One grave has no name, just the words, "We're sorry." That's all. No date, no explanation. You sit a while, watching dusk crawl over the ruins. It's too quiet now. Even the birds avoid this place. Some say the buildings remember, that if you sleep here, the walls whisper at night. You hear footsteps where there shouldn't be any. You see faces that don't belong. Most folks chalk it up to imagination, but imagination doesn't move your bedroll across the room. And yes, that's a real report. One traveler in 1878 claimed to have stayed overnight in an abandoned mining cabin. Woke up outside in the cold. Cabin door still locked from the inside. He left before breakfast and never slept indoors again. You ride on, but you don't look back. Because this is what the West also left behind, places filled with unfinished endings. Towns where something went wrong and no one came to write it down. Places where the silence isn't just emptiness, it's warning. You leave the ghost town behind just as the stars begin to burn sharp above the plains. The path feels lighter now, like a breath held too long is finally exhaled. But don't relax just yet. Because as you ride into the next cluster of lantern lights, you're about to witness a strange truth of the Wild West, the good guys and the bad guys. Often the same person, just wearing a different hat today. Here's your mainstream truth. Law enforcement in the Old West wasn't the noble brotherhood you see in films. There was no standardized police force. Towns hired whoever was handy or scary. Sheriffs were sometimes elected by drunks, bribed by barons, or appointed because no one else wanted the job. It was a role of convenience, not character. And that brings us to the funhouse mirror known as outlaw deputies. You tie up your horse and step into a modest town square. It's midnight, but music spills from the saloon, and across the street, the jail is lit, occupied. A wanted poster flutters on a post. $500, known bandit, suspected in 5 counties. The funny part? You recognize the name. You saw it scratched into the bunk wall of a deputy's barracks back in the last county. Turns out, lawman by day, outlaw by night, wasn't a twist ending. It was Tuesday. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some of the most famous peacekeepers of the West had criminal records. Wyatt Earp, arrested multiple times for horse theft, fraud, and running brothels. His buddy Doc Holliday, a dentist, yes, but also a gambler, killer, and tuberculosis time bomb who once shot a man for insulting his hat. Historians still argue whether Earp was a hero cleaning up Dodge City or just a well-dressed thug who shot first and rewrote the story later. You pass the jail window and glance inside. A man in cuffs lounges on a cot, sipping from a flask. He waves cheerfully. A minute later, the sheriff comes in, unlocks the door, and lets him out. They shake hands. You don't even blink. That's just how things work here. And that's the trick. Alliances were fluid. If you were useful, you got a badge. If you were too useful, you probably also had enemies, and maybe a bounty on your head. The same guy who robbed a stagecoach last week might be wearing a tin star tonight, hired to protect the next one. One example? Henry Plummer, sheriff of Bannock, Montana. Charming, polished, beloved by many. Also, secretly ran a gang called the Innocents, responsible for over 100 murders and robberies. His own townspeople eventually hanged him. Another, Shotgun, Collins, so named for obvious reasons. He patrolled one town with a sword-off and a smile, but took freelance gigs on the side collecting debts for gamblers. Legend says he once arrested a man, escorted him to court, and mugged him on the way back. You sit down on a bench outside the livery stable. Across the street, 2 men argue outside a saloon. One calls the other a cheat. The other pulls a revolver. A shot rings out. The sheriff walks over, scratches his chin, then flips a coin before deciding who to arrest. There's no due process, no Miranda rights. There's just who's standing and who isn't, and sometimes not even that. You ride through the outskirts of town and spot a campfire flickering in the brush. Around it sit 3 figures. One wears a deputy's badge. The other 2? Recognizable from the wanted posters tacked up on the post office wall. They're laughing, sharing a drink, probably reminiscing about last week's train job. That's what the West was. Overlapping roles, blurred lines, and a constant shuffle between right and wrong, depending on who had the fastest draw or the deepest pockets. It wasn't that morality didn't exist. It just didn't pay. You reach the edge of town, and someone calls out behind you, "Watch yourself out there. Not everyone's what they seem." You glance back. It's the sheriff. Or is it the bandit? Hard to say. Maybe both. Either way, he smiles like a man who's written his own ending more than once. And you ride on, realizing something that'll stick with you long past tonight. Out here, justice doesn't wear a white hat. It wears whatever hat is still clean. Morning rises slow, like a reluctant truth, stretching long shadows across the brittle grass. You follow a narrow trail that winds along a dried creek bed, once a water source, now just cracked clay and broken bottles. Ahead, a lone cottonwood leans at a bad angle, and from one of its thick branches hangs a frayed length of rope. It's stained, swaying slightly in the breeze, though nothing moves. You've just stepped into the brutal domain of frontier justice, and trust me, the word justice is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Here's your mainstream truth. The American West lacked formal legal systems in many regions. With judges weeks away and juries nearly non-existent, justice was often served by the loudest men with the most guns. It was swift, public, and horrifyingly casual. You ride into a small settlement where the courthouse is smaller than the saloon and twice as crooked. On the door is scrawled, "Closed for repairs. Use saloon for inquiries." That's not a joke. Many trials did happen in bars, right next to the very poker tables that may have sparked the crime in question. Inside, an old man recounts a trial from years ago. A ranch hand was accused of horse theft. No witnesses, no evidence. The bartender testified that the man looked kinda twitchy, and that was enough. They hanged him before lunch, hung his boots on the bar wall for good measure. Historians still argue whether frontier towns relied on mob rule out of necessity, or because the structure of law was simply too inconvenient. Either way, if you were accused out here, your odds were worse than a one-legged chicken in a coyote den. And here's your fringe tidbit. Some towns kept hanging trees, officially marked, treated with a strange, grim pride. One town in Texas held an annual picnic under theirs. Banners, lemonade, and stories of that time we got justice right. Nobody ever mentioned the ones they got wrong. You step into the jailhouse. It's empty now. Just a rusted iron bed frame and a chalkboard, still faintly etched with names and tallies. The last one reads, June 4th, 2 thieves, 1 drifter, guilty. No court stamp, no appeal. Further up the road, a group of townsfolk gathers in front of a general store. A woman yells at a man who's tied to a post, face bruised. Someone hands her a brick. You don't ask what he did. No one seems certain. The crowd doesn't care. The mood has shifted. You know what's coming next. Lynchings weren't just racial, though race often painted the bullseye. Black, Mexican, and Chinese settlers were frequent victims, but so were the poor, the foreign, the other. Sometimes all it took was looking different, or just being unliked. One account from 1885 details a white man lynched for whistling too much. Another, a teenage girl accused of witchcraft, hanged and buried under a tree no one will point at now. And the worst part? These weren't secret midnight rituals, they were events. People brought sandwiches, took photos, sent postcards. Yes, really. One card from 1908 shows a crowd posing under a swinging body with the handwritten message, "This'll teach 'em." Justice wasn't blind here, it was drunk, armed, and deeply insecure. You ride out of town, shaken, and come upon a crossroads marked with a wooden sign, warning, "Outlaw territory beyond." Below it, another smaller sign reads, "Don't be stupid." Beyond that, nothing but silence and a scorched patch of earth. You stop for a moment and think about all the people who were buried without a word, executed on hearsay, buried in shallow graves, forgotten before the sun even set. You think about how many verdicts were decided with fists, not facts, and how innocent didn't always mean safe. And yet, some people still came west hoping for fairness. A second chance. A place where the past wouldn't follow. And maybe, for a lucky few, it worked. But for most, the rope got there first. The wind changes. It's subtle at first, a slight shift in temperature, the scent of ash and something old. Your horse hesitates, snorts, and paws the ground. You urge it forward, but even you feel it now, a pressure, like walking into a memory someone buried too shallow. You ride into what used to be a town. No sign says the name, but a few burnt foundations, a collapsed well, and a church skeleton tell you people once lived here. Laughed, fought, died. You've arrived in a ghost town. Here's your mainstream truth. By the end of the 19th century, over 1,000 towns were abandoned across the American West. Some ran out of gold. Others dried up with the railroads. A few were wiped out by disease. But they didn't just vanish. They hollowed out, leaving behind shells, shadows, and stories too inconvenient for tourist brochures. The door to what was once a saloon creaks open as you pass. Inside, chairs lie on their sides. A playing card peeks from under a table. A moldy boot sits alone in a corner. The air is thick, not with smell, but with memory. You can almost hear the piano if you stand still enough. A drunk yell, glass shattering, a laugh cut short. Historians still argue whether some of these towns collapsed due to economic factors or whether something else crept in. Fires with no source, families vanishing overnight. You can call it superstition. But walk around long enough and you'll feel it too. The quiet here isn't peaceful. It's loaded. And here's your fringe tidbit. Some of these abandoned towns were repopulated, not by settlers, but by squatters, drifters, and people hiding from the law. One town in Arizona was empty for decades until rangers discovered 5 families living in the cellars of ruined buildings. No names, no paperwork. Just stories they wouldn't share. You spot a house that's mostly intact and decide to explore. The floor groans under your weight. There's a child's toy, hand-carved and missing a wheel, sitting beside a crumbling cradle. No dust on it, which is odd. Someone's been here. You back out slowly. Outside, the wind picks up. A door bangs somewhere behind you. You turn, but there's no one there. You tell yourself it's just the breeze. The West is full of breezes that sound like voices. Further down the street, a jailhouse stands with one rusted cell still locked tight. Through the bars you see scratches on the wall, counting marks like someone kept track of days, or nights, or screams. The final tally stops abruptly. You wonder what happened that day. The roof's caved in at the church, but the bell is still there, hung low like a head bowed in grief. You give it a nudge. It doesn't ring. It clunks, like a throat choked with silence. And this wasn't rare. Ghost towns weren't exotic relics. They were normal. People vanished here because life was impossible. Water ran out. The mine collapsed. The sheriff got shot, and no one came to replace him. And with no law, no supply, no safety, people left. But sometimes not all of them. You come across a cemetery, half swallowed by weeds. Dozens of wooden crosses, some tilted, some snapped. One grave has no name, just the words, "We're sorry." That's all. No date, no explanation. You sit a while, watching dust crawl over the ruins. It's too quiet now. Even the birds avoid this place. Some say the buildings remember, that if you sleep here, the walls whisper at night. You hear footsteps where there shouldn't be any. You see faces that don't belong. Most folks chalk it up to imagination. But imagination doesn't move your bedroll across the room. And yes, that's a real report. One traveler in 1878 claimed to have stayed overnight in an abandoned mining cabin. Woke up outside in the cold. Cabin door still locked from the inside. He left before breakfast and never slept indoors again. You ride on, but you don't look back. Because this is what the West also left behind. Places filled with unfinished endings. Towns where something went wrong and no one came to write it down. Places where the silence isn't just emptiness, it's warning. You're riding through pine-shadowed hills now, the kind of quiet that doesn't just muffle sound, it absorbs it. Even your horse's hooves tread softer here, like they know the ground beneath them has stories no one wants to tell. And soon enough, you see it, a broken stretch of track winding through the cliffs, overgrown and forgotten. Off to one side, tucked behind low brush, sits the ghost of a labor camp, charcoal circles where fires once burned, scraps of fabric buried in dirt, a cracked ceramic bowl with faint blue Chinese characters still etched on the rim. This is what's left of the thousands of Chinese workers who helped build the American West. Here's your mainstream truth. Between 1864 and 1885, tens of thousands of Chinese immigrants came to the U.S., many to California, drawn by gold, rail work, or just a chance at survival. Nearly 90% of the Central Pacific Railroad's workforce was Chinese. They carved tunnels through granite, hung from cliffs with baskets of dynamite, and laid track faster than any crew in history. But when the tracks were done, so was the welcome. You step through what used to be a cookhouse. There's still the outline of a stove, a few rusted cans. Nearby, you find a small shrine, faded joss paper pinned to a stone, a pile of smoothed river rocks carefully arranged. Someone tried to hold on. Even here, your fringe detail? Chinese workers weren't allowed to testify in court against white men in many states. That meant they could be robbed, beaten, even killed, with no legal recourse. In one 1871 case, a white rancher shot 2 Chinese workers for trespassing. His only punishment? A $5 fine. For trespassing, not murder. You pass a cliffside tunnel known to locals as Hell Gate. The Chinese crew that built it worked in freezing winters without proper gear. Dozens died in avalanches or from black powder blasts. Some were buried in the tunnel walls, either by accident or, as some rumors say, on purpose, to keep schedules moving. Historians still debate the truth of that last claim, but the silence of the record speaks volumes. After the railroad boom, jobs dried up fast, but instead of gratitude, Chinese workers were blamed for wage drops, unemployment, even disease. One mayor publicly declared that they brought moral decay and should be cleansed from our shores. By 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act passed, America's first federal immigration law targeting a specific ethnicity. It banned Chinese laborers, denied citizenship, and tore families apart. Those already here were stuck, unable to bring wives or children, forced into bachelor communities, and labeled as permanent outsiders. You pass through a mining site where Chinese laborers once picked over tailings left by white miners. Many were banned from claiming original sites and had to make do with leftovers. But they worked with patience and skill, and often struck small but steady profits. Their reward: arson. In Rock Springs, Wyoming, in 1885, white miners massacred at least 28 Chinese workers, burned their homes, and drove hundreds into the wilderness. The U.S. government expressed regret, but paid no compensation. No one was convicted. You reach the edge of a dry riverbed. A small stone marker stands here. The carving is simple. They never went home. That was the hardest part for many. Most Chinese laborers had planned to return to China, to bring money back, to retire in peace, but exclusion laws, economic traps, and anti-Asian violence left them stranded. Many died alone. Others were buried in mass graves, their names lost. One group tried to preserve dignity, the Chi Kung Tong Society, which spent years exhuming bones from shallow Western graves to return them to ancestral villages in China. It wasn't always possible, but they tried, and still, today, the textbooks barely mention them. You look around at the quiet hills. There's no museum here, no statue, just wind, bone-colored rock, and the invisible outline of lives erased on purpose. But they were here. They built this place, and all they got was the silence. You ride into the final stretch as dusk lowers its curtain, the last of the sun slipping behind jagged mesas, like a show that doesn't know when to end. The road turns gold for a moment, then brown, then gray, then gone. Up ahead, there's a wooden building with faded white paint and a wide, slanted porch. You've seen dozens like it on this journey, but this one isn't a saloon or a jail or a brothel. It's a bookstore. Or it was. You dismount and push the door open. The bell above the frame jingles, surprisingly clear. Inside, everything smells like dust and cracked leather. Shelves lean, crooked under the weight of forgotten stories. One section is labeled Western Heroes. You run your fingers over the spines. The Lawman's Code, Guns of Glory, Ride Fast, Die Noble. None of it matches what you've seen. You've just stepped into the Wild West's final frontier, the myth machine. Here's your mainstream truth. By the early 1900s, the American West had become less a place, more a product. With the frontier officially closed by the 1890 census, nostalgia took over. Writers, illustrators, and later Hollywood filmmakers rushed to fill the void with legends. Outlaws became rebels with charm. Sheriffs turned into noble knights. Women vanished unless they were damsels, and Native Americans, reduced to villains or mystic backdrops. Historians still argue whether this was harmless fantasy or a whitewashed rewriting of a deeply complex history, but the effect is undeniable. The real West, muddy, bloody, morally confusing, was replaced with a cinematic fever dream of horse chases and sunset duels. You sit in a creaky chair and open an old dime novel. The pages crackle. Inside, a hero named Buck Hollister, who fought injustice with a golden revolver and the Bible in his vest. You almost laugh. Then you remember all the actual lawmen who moonlighted as bandits, all the drunks who passed judgment from bar stools, all the heroes who never saw a courtroom unless they were in cuffs. The fringe tidbit? Buffalo Bill Cody, a real scout and buffalo hunter, was one of the first to package and sell the West as entertainment. His Wild West show toured the world, with live shootouts, native reenactors, and Annie Oakley doing tricks on horseback. It made him rich. It also blurred the line between history and spectacle so thoroughly that some school books started quoting his scripts as fact. And Hollywood? Oh, it did the rest. You glance at the cracked television in the corner of the shop. A copy of High Noon sits on a shelf nearby. John Wayne stares from a faded poster, 10 feet tall, hand on holster. He never served in the war, but he played enough cowboys to make millions believe he was one. You look out the shop window. The street is empty. Dust swirls. Somewhere out there, people are still living off the myths, repeating tales of noble sheriffs and bloodthirsty savages, of freedom and wide-open opportunity. But you've seen what's behind the curtain. You've ridden the blood-soaked trails, walked the ghost towns, met the crooked heroes, the forgotten workers, the grieving mothers, the desperate girls behind velvet curtains. You've seen what they left out. And that's the thing. The myth of the West didn't just distort history, it buried it. In dirt, in paperbacks, in Technicolor. Because stories are easier to sell than truth. And truth. It's heavier than a holster full of iron. You rise and leave the bookstore behind. The sky is velvet now, stars poking through. The wind is cooler, softer. Maybe it knows the story's almost over. But before we ride out completely, let's slow down. Let's lay the saddle down and breathe. You find yourself near a campfire now, the horse grazing quietly in the dark, the last sparks of daylight barely clinging to the horizon. You sit back against a warm rock, the kind that holds the sun just a little longer. The fire crackles. The air is finally still. This journey, it wasn't the one in the storybooks. It was harsher, lonelier, more human. And as the stars turn slowly overhead, you feel the weight of it settle, not heavy, just real. Like a coat you've worn all your life, but only just noticed. You think about the people who came west, what they wanted, what they lost. How many lived whole lives without ever touching the myth we later wrapped around them like golden thread? Maybe they never cared about glory. Maybe they just wanted dinner, a roof, someone to laugh with once in a while. The flames flicker lower now, casting long shadows on the canyon wall. Your breath slows. The stories recede into the background, like echoes on the breeze, and all that's left is the hush, the kind that wraps around you like a blanket, woven from everything they left behind. So close your eyes. You're safe here. The West is still out there, wild, flawed, and whispering. But for now, you rest.